Episode 1. Hastings, the day England changed forever. The story begins on a cold October morning in 1066. Picture the rolling hills of southern England, dew still clinging to the grass, as two armies prepare for a clash that would forever alter the fate of Europe. On one side stands King Harold Godwinson of England, fresh from another exhausting battle in the north. His soldiers are weary but resolute. Facing him is Duke William of Normandy, later known as William the Conqueror, a man whose ambition burns hotter than any forge. Both men know that the coming hours will decide not just who wears the crown of England, but the future destiny of an entire kingdom. The Battle of Hastings has long been etched into history as a pivotal moment. But what is often forgotten is the sheer carnage that unfolded that day. Chroniclers speak of fields drenched in blood, of hills piled with corpses, of warriors fighting until exhaustion dropped them where they stood. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, thousands lay dead, their lifeless forms a silent testament to the fury of medieval combat. Harold's army fought on foot, forming a legendary shield wall. This human fortress of interlocked shields was almost impenetrable, and at first, the English seemed destined to repel the Norman invaders. But William was no ordinary commander. He feigned retreat, tricking Harold's men into breaking formation, lured by the chance of victory. In that moment of weakness, Norman cavalry thundered back into the fray, cutting down the scattered English ranks with merciless efficiency. It is said that arrows rained from the sky like a deadly storm. One of them, according to legend, found Harold's eye. Whether fact or myth, the image has endured for centuries. A king struck down by a single shaft, collapsing amidst the chaos of battle. As the English ranks crumbled, the Normans pressed forward, slaughtering those who resisted and chasing down those who fled. By nightfall, the Saxon dream of an independent England had died with its king. The body count at Hastings is staggering when considered in proportion to the armies. Estimates suggest that out of Harold's 7,000, 8,000 troops, nearly half perished. William's side suffered perhaps 2,000 losses. In a single day, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 men were butchered, a bloodletting that dwarfs most battles of its age. To put that into perspective, entire medieval towns often contained fewer inhabitants. Imagine the streets of a small city, emptied of all its men in the space of a few hours. That was Hastings. What followed was no less grim. William's march to London was marked by devastation. Villages that resisted were burned, their inhabitants slaughtered. The conqueror understood that terror was a weapon as sharp as any sword. By crushing resistance through fear, he ensured his grip on power. The English countryside bore the scars for generations. Yet Hastings was not only about bloodshed, it was about transformation. This was the day that England ceased to be purely Anglo-Saxon and became Norman. Castles sprouted across the landscape, foreign lords seized lands, and the language of the conquerors mingled with the native tongue, giving rise to the English we know today. Behind the rivers of blood lay a cultural revolution. Still, we must not forget the human cost. Behind every number was a story. A father who never came home, a young man whose body rotted in the field, a child who grew up without a parent. Medieval chroniclers often glorified war, but beneath their words lie echoes of grief. The Battle of Hastings was not just a clash of kings. It was a massacre of ordinary lives swept up in ambitions far greater than themselves. And this is only the beginning. Hastings set the stage for an age where power was won and lost, not by treaties but by slaughter, where rulers cemented their authority not with words, but with rivers of blood. If this one day could extinguish thousands of lives, what horrors awaited in the centuries that followed? Episode 2. Genghis Khan. The Storm from the Steppes. When we speak of medieval body counts, no figure looms larger than Genghis Khan, the fearsome leader of the Mongol Empire. His name alone conjures images of endless horsemen, sweeping across the horizon, their arrows blotting out the sun, their hooves pounding like thunder across the plains. To many, he was a demon unleashed upon the world. To his people, he was a hero who forged a fractured step into a mighty empire. Yet above all, he was a master of destruction, his campaigns leaving mountains of corpses in their wake. Born as Temujin, in the harsh wilderness of Mongolia, Genghis Khan clawed his way to power through hardship and betrayal. His early years were marked by hunger and exile, but they hardened him into a leader who prized loyalty and discipline above all else. By uniting the feuding tribes of the steppes, he forged a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen, a mobile army of mounted archers who could strike swiftly and vanish before their enemies even grasped what had happened. The Mongols were more than warriors. They were strategists who used fear as a weapon. Entire cities surrendered at the mere rumor of their approach. Those that resisted paid in blood. The chronicles of the time are filled with grim tales. Cities razed to the ground, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. The Mongols left survivors only to spread word of their terror, ensuring that the next city would open its gates without a fight. One of the most infamous examples was the fall of Nishapur in 1221. After the city rebelled and killed a Mongol general, who also happened to be Genghis Khan's son-in-law, the great Khan ordered a punishment so brutal, it echoes through history. According to some accounts, every man, woman, and child, up to 1.7 million people, were executed in retaliation. While medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers, even conservative estimates placed the dead in the hundreds of thousands. It was not merely a victory, it was a warning to the world. But Nishapur was just one of many. The Mongols swept across Central Asia, Persia, and into Eastern Europe, leaving trails of devastation. In 1219, they turned their wrath upon the Khwarezmian Empire. City after city fell. At Urgench, resistance was so fierce that Genghis reportedly ordered the entire population massacred. Chroniclers wrote of corpses piling high like mountains, rivers running red with blood. Whether these descriptions were literal or symbolic, they convey the staggering human toll of Mongol conquest. Perhaps the greatest testament to their ruthlessness was the conquest of Baghdad's neighbor cities decades before the infamous sack of Baghdad itself. As the Mongol armies advanced westward, they showed little mercy. Their philosophy was simple: resist and die, submit and live. But living often meant enslavement, uprooting, and the annihilation of one's culture. The Mongol wars were as much about psychological domination as military conquest. Numbers, though difficult to confirm, paint a horrifying picture. Historians estimate that the Mongol conquests across Eurasia resulted in the deaths of between 30 and 40 million people. In an age where the global population barely reached 400 million, this was an apocalypse on a continental scale. Entire regions were depopulated, farmland abandoned, trade routes disrupted. In some places, it took centuries for populations to recover. And yet, amidst this devastation, there was a paradox. The Mongols also built one of the largest and most stable empires in history. Their Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, created secure trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Ideas, goods, and technologies flowed across Eurasia in ways unseen before. Paper, gunpowder, and printing made their way westward, while art, science, and philosophy crossed back east. It was an empire forged in blood, but one that also knitted the medieval world closer together. Still, we cannot lose sight of the bodies that paved this empire's roads. Behind every figure, 10,000 slain at one city, 100,000 at another, were individual lives cut short. Farmers, merchants, scholars, mothers, children, all swept away by a tide of war they had no power to stop. The Mongols understood the arithmetic of terror. By killing many, they controlled millions more. It was not chaos, but strategy, as cold and calculated as the edge of a blade. For Genghis Khan, numbers were not statistics, but tools. He once declared that the greatest joy in life was to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. This was no empty boast. His empire was written in the blood of millions, and his name remains forever tied to one of the deadliest eras of human history. If Hastings showed us the carnage of a single day, Genghis Khan showed us the destruction of decades. His body count was not measured in thousands, but in tens of millions, entire civilizations broken beneath the hooves of his horsemen. And yet, this is only one chapter in the grim story of medieval bloodshed. For the next horror was not delivered by men, but by nature itself, a silent killer that would wipe out half a continent. Episode 3. The Black Death. Death's Silent March. If Genghis Khan's horsemen brought death by the sword, the Black Death brought it by breath. No army, no fortress, no sword could stop it. Between 1347 and 1351, this silent plague swept through Europe with a force unmatched by any army, leaving behind not smoldering ruins, but empty villages, rotting corpses, and a population cut nearly in half. The body count of this catastrophe dwarfed even the greatest battles of medieval times, changing the world forever. The disease began its deadly march in the east, traveling along the same trade routes that had carried silks and spices for centuries. Fleas riding on the backs of black rats carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and as caravans moved westward, so did the invisible killer. By the time it reached the shores of Europe in 1347, landing in Sicily aboard Genoese trading ships, its fate was sealed. Within months, the plague had spread like wildfire across the continent. And yet, amidst this devastation, there was a paradox. The Mongols also built one of the largest and most stable empires in history. Their Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, created secure trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Ideas, goods, and technologies flowed across Eurasia in ways unseen before. Paper, gunpowder, and printing made their way westward, while art, science, and philosophy crossed back east. It was an empire forged in blood, but one that also knitted the medieval world closer together. Still, we cannot lose sight of the bodies that paved this empire's roads. Behind every figure, 10,000 slain at one city, 100,000 at another, were individual lives cut short. Farmers, merchants, scholars, mothers, children, all swept away by a tide of war they had no power to stop. The Mongols understood the arithmetic of terror. By killing many, they controlled millions more. It was not chaos, but strategy, as cold and calculated as the edge of a blade. Imagine waking up one morning to find your neighbor dead, your family coughing, your village gripped by fear. Buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes, rose on the body like grotesque badges of doom. Victims burned with fever, coughed up blood, and often died within days. The disease struck so fast that chroniclers described men and women dropping dead in the streets, sometimes within hours of first showing symptoms. To those who lived through it, it felt like the end of the world. The death toll is staggering. Historians estimate that between 25 and 50 million people died in Europe alone, perhaps as much as 60% of the population in some regions. Globally, the toll may have reached 75 to 200 million. To put this in perspective, if the Battle of Hastings killed thousands, the Black Death killed tens of thousands every single day, for years on end. Cities once bustling with life became ghost towns. In some villages, not a single soul remained alive to bury the dead. Episode 3. The Black Death. Death's Silent March. If Genghis Khan's horsemen brought death by the sword, the Black Death brought it by breath. No army, no fortress, no sword could stop it. Between 1347 and 1351, this silent plague swept through Europe with a force unmatched by any army, leaving behind not smoldering ruins, but empty villages, rotting corpses, and a population cut nearly in half. The body count of this catastrophe dwarfed even the greatest battles of medieval times, changing the world forever. The disease began its deadly march in the east, traveling along the same trade routes that had carried silks and spices for centuries. Fleas riding on the backs of black rats carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and as caravans moved westward, so did the invisible killer. By the time it reached the shores of Europe in 1347, landing in Sicily aboard Genoese trading ships, its fate was sealed. Within months, the plague had spread like wildfire across the continent. And yet, even in this darkness, the plague reshaped the medieval world in profound ways. With half the population gone, labor became scarce. Serfs demanded higher wages, and the rigid feudal system began to crack. Fields went untended, but those who survived found themselves richer, with more land and opportunities than ever before. The balance of power between peasants and lords shifted, laying the seeds for social transformation. The Church, once the great authority in medieval life, also suffered a devastating blow. Prayers, processions, and relics did nothing to halt the pestilence. As priests fell sick and died, people began to doubt the very institution that had promised salvation. Some turned to extreme forms of penance, such as the flagellants, who whipped themselves publicly to atone for the sins of mankind. Others turned away from religion altogether, seeking meaning in art, literature, and science. The Renaissance, many historians argue, was born in the shadow of the plague. But we must not romanticize. Behind these societal changes were rivers of grief. A widow clutching her dead child, a priest burying dozens of his parishioners in a single day, a farmer watching his entire family succumb one by one. The Black Death was not just history, it was trauma, seared into the collective memory of Europe for centuries. Even generations later, the very mention of plague sent shivers down spines. It is almost impossible to grasp the scale of the Black Death. Imagine walking through a city where every second door is shuttered forever, where entire streets lie silent, where weeds creep between cobblestones because no one remains to tend them. This was the reality of Europe in the late 14th century, a continent not merely wounded, but gutted, reshaped by a killer too small to see. Compared to the battles of Hastings or the campaigns of Genghis Khan, the Black Death was a different kind of slaughter. Faceless, indiscriminate, inescapable. If a sword could be dodged or an enemy negotiated with, the plague offered no quarter. It came for kings and beggars alike, reducing all to the same dust. In terms of sheer body count, no medieval event surpassed it. And when the plague finally receded, the survivors stepped into a new world. Emptier, harsher, yet strangely full of possibility. The Black Death had slain half of Europe, but in its wake, it planted the seeds of transformation. It was a grim reminder that sometimes the deadliest force in history is not man, but nature itself. Episode 4. Agincourt, the Longbow's Reign of Death. In the autumn of 1415, a weary English army trudged through the mud of northern France, sick, starving, and hopelessly outnumbered. Their king, Henry V, had marched boldly into France to claim his ancestral rights, only to find himself cornered by a French force several times his size. The odds were hopeless, and yet, on October 25th, the feast of St. Crispin, the outnumbered English would unleash one of the most stunning and brutal victories of the Middle Ages, the Battle of Agincourt. The story of Agincourt is often told as a triumph of strategy and courage, but at its heart, it is also a story of slaughter. The English army, numbering perhaps 6,000, faced a French host of 20,000 to 30,000. On paper, the French should have crushed them easily. The English were exhausted, many suffering from dysentery, their armor rusted from rain, their spirits low. But Henry V had a weapon more powerful than numbers: the English longbow. The longbow was a marvel of medieval warfare. Nearly 6 feet tall, requiring years of training and immense strength to wield. It could pierce armor at ranges where crossbows and javelins were useless. On the fields of Agincourt, thousands of English archers planted sharpened stakes in front of them and waited for the French knights to charge. When the French cavalry surged forward, they entered a killing field. Arrows rained down in endless waves, hissing through the air before slamming into armor, flesh, and horse alike. Chroniclers wrote that it seemed as though the very sky darkened under the storm of arrows. Horses collapsed, knights toppled, and the charge faltered before it had even reached the English line. Those who pressed forward found themselves tangled in mud, their heavy armor dragging them down like anchors. The ground itself betrayed the French. Days of rain had turned the field into a swampy mire. Horses stumbled, knights slipped, and as more pressed in from behind, the front ranks were crushed under their comrades' weight. Some suffocated in their armor, drowning in mud and blood. Others were pinned down, unable to rise as English archers and men-at-arms closed in with knives and mallets, finishing them where they lay. By the battle's end, the French nobility had been decimated. Between 7,000 and 10,000 French soldiers lay dead, compared to only a few hundred English casualties. Among the fallen were some of France's most powerful nobles, their blood soaking the soil of Agincourt. The massacre was so complete that it stunned Europe. How could a small, sickly army destroy the flower of French chivalry? The answer lay not only in weaponry and terrain, but in Henry's ruthlessness. During the battle, fearing a counterattack or an uprising from captured nobles, Henry ordered the execution of hundreds of French prisoners. This act, controversial even in its own time, underscored the brutality of Agincourt. The battle was not merely a clash of armies, but an extermination, a reminder that in war, mercy was often a luxury leaders could not afford. The body count at Agincourt was catastrophic for France. An entire generation of knights and nobles was cut down in a single day, their corpses heaped in the mud. For England, it was a miracle that cemented Henry V's reputation as one of the greatest warrior kings of his age. His St. Crispin's Day speech, immortalized later by Shakespeare, painted the battle as a heroic stand of the few against the many. But beneath the poetry lies a grim truth. Agincourt was less a noble contest of arms and more a slaughter orchestrated by mud, arrows, and desperation. Beyond the immediate carnage, the battle shifted the course of the 100 Years' War. For years afterward, the French struggled to recover from the loss of so many of their leaders, while England tightened its grip on northern France. Yet in the end, the victory was temporary. Though Agincourt glittered like a jewel in English memory, it did not bring lasting conquest. But for one day in 1415, the English longbowmen wrote their legend in blood. What makes Agincourt unforgettable is the contrast. Knights clad in shining armor, proud symbols of medieval chivalry, brought low by mud, hunger, and a rain of arrows. The battlefield became a graveyard of nobility, where status meant nothing and survival came down to whether you could crawl out of the muck before another wave of arrows struck. Agincourt was not the largest battle of the Middle Ages, nor the deadliest in sheer numbers, but its symbolic weight was immense. It shattered the myth of invincible knights, showing that discipline and technology could overturn centuries of martial tradition. It also left behind thousands of corpses rotting in the fields, a reminder that even glorious victories leave behind a stench of death. The mud of Agincourt buried more than men, it buried illusions. The age of knights was ending, and the age of disciplined infantry and ranged warfare was dawning. And yet, as we look back, it is not strategy or innovation that lingers most vividly. It is the image of arrows blotting out the sky, of men sinking into the mud, of a field transformed into a swamp of bodies. Agincourt was a legend, yes, but it was also a massacre. Episode 5. Constantinople, the Fall of 1,000 Years. For over 1,000 years, the city of Constantinople stood like a jewel between two worlds. Founded by Constantine the Great, it became the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, a fortress of faith, wealth, and culture that defied invaders for centuries. Its walls were legendary, its churches magnificent, its treasury vast. But in 1453, all of that came crashing down in a storm of cannon fire and blood. The fall of Constantinople was not merely the end of a city, it was the death knell of an empire, and one of the bloodiest sieges in medieval history. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, was determined to succeed where generations of armies had failed. He brought with him an army of over 80,000 soldiers, including elite janissaries, and terrifying new weapons, massive cannons that hurled stone balls the size of boulders at the city's walls. Facing him was Emperor Constantine XI, with perhaps 7,000 defenders, Greeks, Venetians, and Genoese mercenaries, holding on to a fragment of a once mighty empire. For nearly 2 months, the Ottomans pounded Constantinople day and night. The great walls shook under the relentless bombardment. Towers crumbled, gates splintered, but still the defenders held. Chronicles describe the city's churches filled with prayers, chants echoing as citizens begged God for deliverance. Every breach in the wall was patched with wood, earth, and sheer desperation. But even the strongest faith could not withstand Mehmed's determination. Agincourt was not the largest battle of the Middle Ages, nor the deadliest in sheer numbers, but its symbolic weight was immense. It shattered the myth of invincible knights, showing that discipline and technology could overturn centuries of martial tradition. It also left behind thousands of corpses rotting in the fields, a reminder that even glorious victories leave behind a stench of death. The mud of Agincourt buried more than men, it buried illusions. The age of knights was ending, and the age of disciplined infantry and ranged warfare was dawning. And yet, as we look back, it is not strategy or innovation that lingers most vividly. It is the image of arrows blotting out the sky, of men sinking into the mud, of a field transformed into a swamp of bodies. Agincourt was a legend, yes, but it was also a massacre. On May 29, 1453, the final assault began. Waves of soldiers crashed against the walls, arrows and cannon fire filling the sky. The defenders fought valiantly, but exhaustion and numbers took their toll. At dawn, the janissaries stormed through a small gate left unguarded. Chaos erupted as the defenders broke, and Constantine XI, refusing to flee, is said to have cast off his imperial regalia and charged into the fray, never to be seen again. The last emperor of Rome died sword in hand, buried beneath the tide of his enemies. What followed was not victory, but horror. For 3 days, the city was subjected to sack and slaughter. Ottoman troops rampaged through the streets, killing without mercy. Men, women, and children were cut down or dragged into slavery. Churches, once sanctuaries of peace, became slaughterhouses. Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of Christendom, was filled with terrified citizens seeking refuge, only to be trampled and enslaved as the invaders stormed inside. The body count from those 3 days alone numbered in the tens of thousands. The sack of Constantinople was not unique by medieval standards, but its symbolism was enormous. For over a millennium, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the heir of Rome, the shield of Christendom against the East. Now, in a single stroke, it was gone. Europe reeled in shock, while the Ottomans claimed their prize. Mehmed II rode triumphantly into the city, declaring it the new capital of his empire, renaming it Istanbul. Hagia Sophia, once a beacon of Christian glory, was converted into a mosque. Estimates of the death toll vary, but some chronicles suggest as many as 50,000 people were killed or enslaved. The population of Constantinople, already weakened by centuries of decline, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The streets, once filled with scholars, merchants, and priests, were littered with corpses. The empire that had endured for over 1,000 years ended in fire and blood. Yet the fall of Constantinople was more than a massacre. It was a turning point. Its capture cut off Europe's access to Eastern trade, forcing explorers to seek new routes by sea. This, in turn, sparked the age of exploration, sending ships westward that would eventually discover the New World. From the ashes of Constantinople rose a new era, one that shifted the balance of power forever. Still, the human cost should not be forgotten. Behind the grand narratives of empire and exploration are the screams of mothers clutching their children, the blood of priests cut down at their altars, the despair of citizens watching their city burn. Constantinople's fall was not only the end of an empire, but the tragedy of thousands whose lives were extinguished in a single storm of conquest. For centuries afterward, travelers spoke of the city's silence. Its streets, once glorious, carried echoes of death. The great empire of the Byzantines had been erased, but the memory of its fall lived on. The siege of Constantinople was not the first time a city was drenched in blood, nor would it be the last, but it remains one of the most haunting. The day when 1,000 years of history ended beneath the weight of cannonballs and swords. Episode 6. A Century of Attrition. War without end. Across the span from 1337 to 1453, the 100 Years' War did not so much happen as seep into every corner of life. It was a weather system of violence, battles like thunderstorms, sieges like long winters, and the in-between seasons ruled by hungry men with nothing to lose. A boy could be born under truce and die during a raid without ever seeing the front lines, yet still count the war among the facts of his life, like taxes, like harvests, like the church bell. Its body count came not only from spectacular slaughters, but from the slower arithmetic of ruin. Burned fields, emptied barns, vanished villages, and the miles of road that became cemeteries without markers. The war is remembered for set-piece triumphs, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, where English longbows and disciplined infantry overturned the pride of French chivalry. Yet even these great names understate the human cost. Crécy, 1346, left fields carpeted with the shields of dead nobles. Poitiers, 1356, ended with a king of France, John II, a prisoner of the English and thousands of his men dead or missing. Agincourt, 1415, as we have seen, tore through the French aristocracy like a scythe. But for every famous morning of arrows and mud, there were 100 nights of quieter devastation. Barns set alight, mills broken, vineyards hacked to stumps, bridges toppled into silence, and bodies, not soldiers, not always, folded into ditches to wait for spring's thaw. If you want a single picture of how this war killed, look to the Siege of Calais, 1346, 1347. After Edward III's victory at Crécy, the English drew a noose of earthworks and ships around the port and simply waited. No heroic charge, no shining clash of lances. Inside, the people of Calais ate their food and then, slowly, they ate their future. When even grass and leather were gone, the city expelled its poor to spare a crust for the rest. The English would not let the starving pass. In the end, when the burghers walked out in bare feet and rope halters, offering their lives for the town, the story goes that Queen Philippa begged mercy and saved them. The burghers lived, but many others did not. Calais fell, not through a brilliant stroke of arms, but through mathematics. More mouths than meals, more days than loaves. That is a kind of killing, too. Then there were the chevauchés. Armed rides meant not to conquer castles, but to unmake economies. In 1355, the Black Prince swept through Languedoc with a moving firestorm. Crops torched, tools smashed, livestock driven off, towns forced to pay or burn. He could count victory by how many chimneys no longer smoked at dusk. The next year he came north again, drawing the French into the fatal trap of Poitiers. But even had no battle followed, the chevauchée had already done its arithmetic. A burned granary kills more certainly than a sword. The winter after such a ride brings the harvest of the dead. Violence also came in the form of companies of unemployed soldiers, the routiers, the grandes compagnies, who, in the long pauses between truces and treaties, turned their trade upon the people. They occupied a hilltop priory, fortified a bridge, or nested in a half-ruined castle, and taxed the surrounding land with spear and torch. Farmers learned new words: the pâtisse, a protection payment; the écorcheurs, skinners, who relieved you of coin; animals, clothes, hope. In some stretches of the Saône and Loire, chroniclers wrote of fields lying idle, villages blown away like dust. Whether fathers fled to the towns or sons to the woods, the net result was the same: fewer hands to plant, fewer backs to reap, fewer children to survive the lean year that always seemed to follow. There were moments of concentrated horror, too. Limoges, 1370. When the city changed sides, the Black Prince returned in anger. A chronicler, Froissart, claimed that the English cut down thousands in a single morning, filling streets with bodies until a horse could scarcely pick its way through. Modern historians question his count. The truth is elusive. Yet even if the number is smaller, the point is not. Limoges shows how quickly the war could turn from banners to burial. A rumor, a sudden breach, the storming of a gate, and then the slow inventory of the dead that has to be done by those who remain. For all the banners and pageantry, the war's worst killing worked by subtraction. A garrison took the mill's stones to build a wall, and the village lost its flour. The Lord's keep demanded aids, and the tenant cut back on seed, planting hope too thin to sprout. Disease, ever the war's ally, walked through broken doors. The Black Death arrived 2 decades into the conflict, and never truly went away. Plague returned in waves, each crest finding a countryside more vulnerable than the last. War made plague, plague made famine, famine made war, as men with empty larders go looking for full ones, and those with full ones hire men to protect them. Year by year, tally by tally, the losses mounted in the quiet columns of manor rolls, where long lists of tenants collapse into blank lines. Numbers matter, and yet they slip away. How many died at Poitiers? 2,000? 4? Chroniclers could count fallen knights with names and crests. But how do you number the dead from a burned hamlet that left no clerk behind? In some regions of northern France, the record of hearth taxes shows entire parishes dimming and then going out. The map of the war is a constellation of absences, villages that no longer appear in later surveys, water meadows that no longer bear a name. If Hastings killed in a day, the 100 Years' War killed in a generation, and then another. But the story is not only subtraction. Deep in the wreckage you can see how suffering reshaped the world. Lords learned to hire soldiers on wages rather than summon feudal hosts. Kings learned to tax more steadily and centralize their power. Parliaments in England bargained money for oversight. In France, royal bureaucracy grew like a spine. Warfare itself changed. Archers and footmen, earthworks and gunpowder slowly shouldered aside the bright geometry of mounted knights. Towns ringed themselves with thicker walls and more careful accounts. Even mercy professionalized. Ransoms and prisoners became ledgers rather than afterthoughts. Episode 7. The Crusades. Holy Wars, Bloody Counts. The Middle Ages were an age of faith, and few events demonstrate the marriage of faith and violence more than the Crusades. Beginning in 1095 when Pope Urban II called upon Christians to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control, waves of knights, peasants, and adventurers surged eastward under the banner of the cross. What was promised as a holy pilgrimage often became a theater of slaughter, leaving behind not just relics of devotion, but rivers of blood. The body counts of these wars stretch across centuries and continents, making them among the deadliest and most transformative conflicts of the medieval world. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, began with chaos before it even reached the Holy Land. Vast mobs of peasants, poorly armed and poorly led, marched across Europe in what became known as the People's Crusade. Along the way, some turned their fervor against Jewish communities in the Rhineland, slaughtering thousands of innocents in pogroms that stained the cause before it had even begun. When the survivors finally reached Anatolia, most were cut down by Turkish forces. Yet the professional armies that followed achieved what many thought impossible: the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. The fall of Jerusalem was one of the bloodiest episodes of the entire medieval era. Chroniclers, both Muslim and Christian, describe scenes of shocking carnage. When the Crusaders breached the city, they slaughtered nearly every inhabitant: Muslims, Jews, and even some Christians. The streets reportedly ran with blood, corpses piled in the courtyards of mosques and synagogues. One eyewitness claimed that men rode their horses through gore that reached their knees. Estimates vary, but tens of thousands were killed in a matter of days. For the victors, it was seen as divine justice. For the victims, it was apocalypse. The later Crusades brought their own harvests of death. At Hastings in 1187, Saladin, the great Muslim commander, annihilated the Crusader army, capturing the true cross and shattering Christian power in the region. Thousands of knights and soldiers perished under the scorching sun of Palestine, and Jerusalem once again fell, this time to Muslim hands. Yet even Saladin, remembered for his chivalry, could not prevent bloodshed. Prisoners too poor or insignificant to ransom were executed en masse, their bodies left as grim monuments to defeat. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, recaptured some coastal cities, but also demonstrated the pitiless nature of holy war. After besieging Acre in 1191, Richard ordered the massacre of around 2,700 Muslim prisoners when negotiations faltered. Men, women, and children were cut down on the plain outside the city, while the Crusader army looked on. To his supporters, it was necessity. To his enemies, it was butchery. And then came the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, which turned its swords not against Muslims but against fellow Christians. Diverted by Venetian interests, the Crusaders besieged Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. In 1204, they stormed its walls and unleashed a sack so brutal it shocked even contemporaries. Churches were looted, relics desecrated, civilians massacred. Nuns were raped in convents, treasures of antiquity melted down, libraries scattered to the winds. The city never fully recovered, and the Byzantine Empire staggered on as a shell of its former self. Here, holy war revealed itself as naked greed and cruelty. Across 2 centuries, the crusading ideal inspired 9 major campaigns and countless smaller expeditions. In the Baltic, Crusaders waged war on pagan peoples, wiping out entire tribes. In Spain, the Reconquista unfolded as a centuries-long crusade against Muslim rule, culminating in rivers of blood when cities like Granada and Seville changed hands. Each campaign left behind its own tally of the dead, sometimes soldiers on battlefields, sometimes civilians caught in massacres. Estimates of total casualties are almost impossible, but millions were likely killed across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa in the name of the cross. Yet the Crusades were not only wars of death, they were crucibles of change. The mingling of cultures sparked exchanges of knowledge, art, and technology. Europeans carried home spices, medicine, and new ideas, even as they left behind broken bodies. The memory of the Crusades also deepened divisions between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, scars that in some ways still ache today. Behind the banners and the sermons, however, the reality was always the same. Families torn apart, cities emptied, bones whitening under foreign suns. Crusaders sang hymns as they marched, but their swords carved the same grim arithmetic as any mercenary's blade. Whether Jerusalem or Constantinople, Acre or Antioch, the holy wars piled corpses as high as any secular one. The Crusades show us how faith can inspire both hope and horror. They produced martyrs and saints, but also butchers and betrayers. And through it all, the body count rose. The holy city of Jerusalem changed hands several times, each exchange marked by massacres. Constantinople, once the jewel of Christendom, was reduced to rubble by its supposed defenders. Villages across Europe wept as their sons never returned, their bones left to bleach on distant sands. If Hastings marked the rise of new kingdoms, if Genghis Khan embodied conquest by horse, and if the Black Death revealed nature's wrath, the Crusades revealed something darker still: humanity's ability to wrap violence in righteousness. In their name, millions marched, millions died, and the world was forever changed. Episode 8. Baghdad, a city drowned in blood. If the Crusades revealed the bloodshed born of faith, the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 showed the devastation born of vengeance and empire. Once the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad was a city of libraries, scholars, poets, and merchants. Its house of wisdom was famed across the world, a treasury of human knowledge where Greek, Persian, and Indian learning blended with Arabic brilliance. But in February of 1258, all of this ended in a storm of fire and steel. The body count from that week remains one of the most horrifying episodes in all of medieval history. The Mongols, under Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived with perhaps 150,000 troops. Baghdad, ruled by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim, was woefully unprepared. Its once great army had dwindled, its defenses weak, its leadership indecisive. When the Mongols demanded surrender, the Caliph hesitated. It was a fatal mistake. The Mongols had already razed cities across Persia and Mesopotamia. Their reputation for annihilation preceded them. Resistance, they believed, had only one answer: extinction. The siege lasted just 2 weeks. Mongol engineers, masters of siegecraft, rained projectiles and fire upon the city's walls. Soon a breach was made, and the Mongol horde poured in. What followed was not battle but massacre. For 7 days, Baghdad was turned into a charnel house. Men, women, and children alike were slaughtered without mercy. Streets clogged with corpses. The Tigris River is said to have run red with blood. Chroniclers, perhaps exaggerating, claimed 800,000 to over 1 million were killed. Even if these numbers swell beyond reality, there is no doubt the slaughter was immense. The Caliph himself was captured, humiliated, and executed. Reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses so his blood would not be spilled directly, an act both symbolic and cruel. The Abbasid dynasty, which had ruled for 5 centuries, ended in that moment. The Mongols intended not just conquest but erasure. The cultural destruction was just as immense as the human cost. The House of Wisdom, with its priceless manuscripts and irreplaceable works, was thrown into the Tigris. Legend claims the river ran black with ink for days. Whether literally true or not, the metaphor captures the catastrophe. Centuries of learning drowned in a single week of violence. A city that had once symbolized the pinnacle of human civilization was reduced to ashes and silence. The massacre of Baghdad sent shockwaves through the world. To Muslims, it was a calamity of almost apocalyptic proportions. To Christians in Europe, it was proof that even the great Islamic power was vulnerable before the Mongols' wrath. For the Mongols themselves, it was a statement. No empire, no dynasty, no city was beyond their reach. But beyond the symbolism, the human stories cry out most. Families who had studied, traded, prayed, and thrived for generations were wiped out in days. Children cut down in courtyards, mothers executed in markets, scholars silenced at their desks. The great bazaars of Baghdad, once filled with voices from across the known world, became silent graveyards. The sack of Baghdad also left a scar upon history itself. The city never fully recovered its prominence. Though it remained inhabited and would later be rebuilt, it was no longer the unrivaled center of the Islamic world. Political power shifted elsewhere, and the memory of the massacre lingered as a warning. In terms of body count, the sack stands as one of the largest single massacres of the medieval era. Even conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, were killed. But more than just numbers, Baghdad's fall symbolizes the fragility of civilization itself. In 1 week, a city that had flourished for centuries was undone. The work of generations, art, science, philosophy, was obliterated in a tide of vengeance. If Hastings showed us conquest, if the Black Death revealed nature's wrath, if the Crusades taught us the cruelty of faith, then Baghdad showed the fragility of brilliance. Civilization can build libraries that hold the wisdom of ages, but in the clash of empires, those libraries can become ashes. The Mongols left behind not just corpses, but an eternal question. How much of human knowledge has been lost forever to the swords of conquerors? The sack of Baghdad was not only a body count, it was a soul count. A city's body was slain, and its soul was scattered to the winds. Episode 9. Roses and Blood. England's Civil War. When we think of medieval bloodshed, our minds leap to invasions, crusades, and plagues. But sometimes the greatest carnage came not from foreign foes or distant conquerors, but from within a kingdom's own heart. Such was the case with the Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic struggles that tore England apart during the 15th century. Between 1455 and 1487, noble houses, kings, and common soldiers bled across fields from St. Albans to Bosworth. The wars earned their name from the symbols of their rival factions, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. But what they truly planted in the soil of England was not roses, it was corpses. At the root of the conflict lay a crisis of succession. King Henry VI of Lancaster was a weak ruler, plagued by bouts of mental illness and unable to control ambitious nobles. The House of York, with its claim to the throne, saw an opportunity. What followed was not one war but a chain of wars, rebellions and betrayals that turned England into a graveyard of knights. The battles themselves were ferocious, often involving thousands of men in desperate melee. At Towton in 1461, perhaps the bloodiest single battle ever fought on English soil, as many as 50,000 men clashed in a snowstorm. Chroniclers describe rivers running red with blood, frozen corpses piled in heaps, and soldiers drowning as they tried to flee across icy streams. Estimates suggest 20,000 to 28,000 were killed in a single day, nearly 1% of England's entire population at the time. Towton was more than a battle. It was a national trauma, a butcher's yard under the falling snow. Yet Towton was not the only massacre. The battles of Barnet, 1471, and Tewkesbury, 1471, also left thousands dead. After Tewkesbury, the victors pursued the defeated Lancastrians into an abbey, slaying those who sought sanctuary. Even sacred spaces were no shield from the sword. This disregard for sanctuary showed how civil war eroded the boundaries of custom and honor. In the heat of dynastic struggle, nothing was sacred and nothing was safe. Beyond the battlefields, the wars took their toll on families and communities. Noble houses were extinguished. Their lines ended in sudden beheadings or battlefield deaths. Entire villages lost their men in single days of fighting, leaving widows and orphans behind. The shifting tides of power meant that one year's loyal subject could be next year's traitor, condemned to execution or exile. Heads of nobles adorned the gates of cities, grim trophies in a cycle of vengeance. The Wars of the Roses also brought a culture of betrayal. Alliances shifted like sand. Nobles who fought for Lancaster at one battle might fight for York at the next. Families split against themselves. Even kings were not spared. Henry VI was deposed, restored, and deposed again before finally being murdered in the Tower of London. Richard III, infamous in legend, seized the throne only to fall at Bosworth in 1485, his body stripped and mocked. His defeat ended the conflict and brought Henry Tudor to power as Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. The body count across the wars is difficult to measure. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of soldiers died, alongside countless civilians who were caught in raids, pillaging, and reprisals. While the numbers pale compared to plagues or Mongol conquests, the impact on England was immense. The nobility was decimated, whole dynasties wiped out. Fields lay untended, trade disrupted, and the common people suffered under the endless burden of taxes, levies, and fear. But as with so many tragedies, new beginnings emerged from the ruins. The Tudor dynasty brought stability, ending the cycle of dynastic bloodshed. Yet the memory of the wars lingered in English culture, a cautionary tale about ambition and civil strife. Shakespeare would later immortalize the conflict in his plays, turning real rivers of blood into poetry and drama. Behind his words, however, lie the real cries of the fallen. The Wars of the Roses were not merely contests of crowns. They were struggles that turned England against itself. Unlike Hastings, where invaders clashed for conquest, or Constantinople, where empires fell to outsiders, here the killing was fratricidal. Englishman against Englishman, brother against brother, cousin against cousin. The red rose and the white rose were not just symbols of rival houses. They were reminders that civil war leaves no corner of a kingdom untouched. If Towton was the bloodiest day, the war as a whole was a slow drain, a bleeding that lasted for 3 decades. And when at last Henry Tudor stood victorious, England breathed a sigh of relief, but it did so over fields sown with bones. The roses may have symbolized beauty, but their thorns were dipped in blood. Episode 10. Lessons Written in Blood. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, the echoes of its body counts lingered in memory, song, and scar. Hastings had shown how a single day's clash could overturn dynasties. Genghis Khan and his heirs revealed the terrible efficiency of conquest by fear. The Black Death proved that nature, not only man, could reap half a world in weeks. Agincourt exposed the fragility of knights before the storm of arrows. Constantinople's fall ended 1,000 years of empire in 3 days of fire. The 100 Years' War bled a continent slowly, one chevauchée, one siege, one famine at a time. The Crusades painted religion in shades of both faith and cruelty. Baghdad's sack reminded us that even knowledge can be drowned in blood. And the Wars of the Roses revealed how ambition can turn a nation against itself, leaving fields of kin cut down by kin. The Middle Ages are often remembered with romance. Castles and banners, knights and troubadours, relics and pilgrimages. But behind every castle wall was a graveyard, and behind every hymn, the silence of the dead. The truth is not romantic. It is arithmetic. In the medieval world, life was cheap, and power was often measured in how many bodies one could command or destroy. Yet even as we recoil at the numbers, we must remember that these were not just statistics. 6,000 at Hastings meant 6,000 families bereft. Millions under Mongol conquest were millions of faces, each with a voice lost to the dust. The Black Death's 50 million dead meant 50 million unfinished stories. Children who never grew old, lovers who never wed, songs never sung. The body counts of medieval history were not faceless. They were human. each as vivid as we are now.
And yet, from this soil soaked in blood, grew new worlds.
The Mongol Empire opened roads across Eurasia that carried not only goods, but ideas. The Black Death, in destroying half of Europe, cracked the old feudal order and prepared the way for Renaissance and reform. The Crusades brought violence, but also the exchange of art, science, and philosophy. The fall of Constantinople pushed Europeans to seek new routes westward, voyages that reshaped the globe. Even civil wars, bitter and ruinous, cleared the field for stronger monarchies that would shape the modern state. This is the paradox of history. Destruction breeds creation. Endings give rise to beginnings. The blood spilled in the Middle Ages fertilized the roots of the world we inhabit today. But that does not mean we should forget the cost. The bones of peasants under Teuton's snow, the ashes of Baghdad's libraries, the corpses piled in Jerusalem, the silent churches of plague-stricken Florence, all whisper reminders that progress is never free. So when we speak of the craziest body counts of medieval history, we are not merely tallying numbers. We are listening to echoes. We are acknowledging that the world we inherit was bought with lives we will never know. Their blood writes the margins of every manuscript, stains the stones of every cathedral, and haunts the silence of every ruined castle. The medieval body counts remind us of something deeply human. Our brilliance and our brutality are bound together. We build and we destroy. We pray and we kill. We seek beauty and we leave behind bones. The lesson is not simply to recoil at the carnage, but to recognize the weight of choices, then and now. For as much as we look back in horror at the Middle Ages, the same forces still live among us. Ambition, fear, faith, and the frailty of life itself. The story ends where it began, with the question of what we remember. Will history recall the banners or the bodies? The kings or the corpses, the victories or the vanished? Perhaps the only true answer is both. For the Middle Ages, for all their glory and cruelty, gave us not just castles and crowns, but also the eternal truth that power and death walk hand in hand. And so we close the book on these centuries of slaughter. But the echoes remain, calling us to remember. Not just the numbers, but the people.
And in the villages, the survivors stitched life back together. A woman who had buried a husband and 2 sons became the spine of a farm. A carpenter turned his hand to repairing bridges instead of pikes. An orphan learned to drive oxen and inherited a strip of land because there was no one else left to do it. The war took, but it also, slowly, painfully, rearranged. Out of its attrition came not only graves but offices, taxes, and the stubborn fact of newer states that would, in time, make their own wars. To speak of body counts in the 100 Years' War is to court a paradox. The most honest numbers are the least precise. We can reckon noble dead in battles and totals from the more spectacular sieges, but the truest accounting is felt in silences. The missing names at Candlemas, the cottages that never relight their hearths, the orchards that go to scrub. Think of a ledger where the ink has faded not in one place but everywhere, and you begin to understand the sum. At its century's end, with Joan of Arc burned and remembered, with English claims receding toward the sea, with Calais still a foreign tooth fastened in France's jaw, the survivors did what survivors do. They planted. The earth accepted seed as it always had, indifferent to banners. But even as new wheat greened the fields, the war's arithmetic lingered in the bones of those who bent to reap it. And when, at last, this long weather of violence blew itself out, another storm, religion's fury and crusading memory and frontier zeal, waited on the horizon, eager to claim its own tally in the name of heaven.